Up Daniel chapter 6. Let's just remind ourselves of what has happened so far in the book of Daniel, so we understand the context in which Daniel chapter 6 occurs, and we'll read some verses from Daniel chapter 6 shortly. Daniel chapter 1 starts with Judah being conquered by the great empire of the time, Babylon. Daniel and others are taken from Jerusalem as captives back to Babylon. Daniel is a young man, maybe 13, 14, 15, certainly a young teenager at that time. Daniel chapter 1. He goes into study and he passes with flying colors. Daniel chapter 2. King Nebuchadnezzar has a bit of an ego on his head. Like most kings of that time. He has a dream. He couldn't interpret the dream. Daniel tells him what the dream is and interprets that dream. And King Nebuchadnezzar likes it because it says his kingdom and his rule is a gold, represented by a gold statue and the gold head on that statue. He kind of likes that. I think that goes to his head because in Daniel chapter 3, he builds a gold statue and requires everyone to bow down to it. And 3 of Daniel's friends refuse to do so, even in the face of being thrown into the fiery furnace. They're thrown into the fiery furnace, but God delivers them and saves them, and they survive. Daniel chapter 4, King Nebuchadnezzar forgets the lesson that God is in control. He gets his ego back. He surveys his kingdom and thinks, how good am I? God strikes him down so that he becomes like an animal and lives in the field for 7 years until he looks up and recognizes who God is and his sanity is restored to him. Daniel chapter 4. Daniel chapter 5, we have Belshazzar is the new king. King Nebuchadnezzar was his grandfather. He's forgotten all the lessons that the King Nebuchadnezzar learned. He has an ego on his head. God strikes him down. Another Sunday school story. Handwriting on the wall. Who interprets that? Daniel. And then we come to Daniel chapter 6, and we'll read some verses together in that context. Daniel chapter 6. Let's read verses 1 to 12. And then 16 to 24. So you'll see it's not the whole chapter, but we'll get an idea of what's happening in this chapter. Daniel chapter 6, verses 1 through to 12, first of all. It pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps, or governors, to rule throughout the kingdom, with 3 administrators over them, one of whom was Daniel. The satraps were made accountable to them so that the king might not suffer loss. Now Daniel so distinguished himself amongst the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. At this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Finally, these men said, we will never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with the law of his God. So these administrators and satraps went as a group to the king and said, may King Darius live forever. The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or human being during the next 30 days, except to you, your majesty, shall be thrown into the lion's den. Verse 8. Now, your majesty, issue the decree and put it in writing so that it cannot be altered, in accordance with the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed. So King Darius put the decree in writing. Verse 10. Now when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room, where the windows opened towards Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God just as he had done before. Verse 11, then these men went as a group and found Daniel praying and asking God for help. So they went to the king and spoke to him about his royal decree. Did you not publish a decree that during the next 30 days, anyone who prays to any god or human being except you, your majesty, would be thrown into the lion's den? The king answered, the decree stands in accordance with the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed. Moving down to verse 16 now. So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, may your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you. A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and the rings of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation may not be changed. Then the king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating and without any entertainment being brought to him, and he could not sleep. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he came near to the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions? Daniel answered, may the king live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me because I was found innocent in his sight, nor have I ever done anything wrong before you, your majesty. The king was overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him because he had trusted in his God. Verse 24, at the king's command, the men who falsely accused Daniel were brought in and thrown into the lion's den, along with their wives and children. And before they reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered them and crushed all of their bones. And we'll finish off looking at the balance of the chapter shortly. Remember that story from those of you who went to Sunday school, from Sunday school times? As much as you enjoyed it then, it's a refreshing story that tells us of God's faithfulness and the fact that he is in control. Don't know about you, but sometimes some weeks more than others remind us that there are ups and downs in life, that it's not always plain sailing, that there are things that come along that challenge us. You know, when life is going well, when there are ups in our lives, it's much easier for us to go, I can see how God is working. I can see God at work. We can see that, can't we? But then the challenges of life come and we start scratching our head and going, ooh, can't see it quite so clearly now. You know, what if you're at the point of a gun, being threatened with your life unless you renounce your faith in Jesus? Is God still in control? What if you've been made fun of or ridiculed because of your faith? You know, there are times when our culture and the society that we live in thinks that what we believe is just plain silly. When we're ridiculed and we're challenged or rejected for our faith, is God still in control? Or maybe we've lost our job, or maybe we're facing challenges in our work, and that same question still arises, doesn't it? Is God in control? Or maybe we're facing health issues and the challenges of life from a health perspective, and we wonder, is God still in control? You see, as many other situations that we encounter as part of life, so are the times that God calls us to be faithful. Because when we are faithful, God does his work. You see, when we are faithful, even in times when we don't understand, God is at work. And when we're faithful, we don't miss out on the opportunity for God to work through us. You know, I think this is something that Daniel knew and he recorded because he wanted to teach us this particular lesson. Over all of Daniel's life, he wanted to teach us that if you are faithful in your work and you're faithful in your worship to the Lord God, he is faithful, he can be trusted, he will work in his own ways in and through our faithful obedience. And so the lesson that we will see from Daniel chapter 6 as we unpack that and work through together is this, that when we are faithful in our work and faithful in our worship, God is at work and God's name is praised. When we are faithful in our work, faithful in our worship, God is at work and his name is praised. And we'll see how Daniel unpacks that lesson for us as we work through Daniel chapter 6 this morning. Let's remind ourselves, and we've already done so, but the transition from the Babylonian Empire to the empire of the Medes and the Persians happened on a specific date, 12 October 539 BC, 1 or 2 years ago, right? And we know that from the records of history, that on that night, the Medes and the Persians stormed what was thought to be the impregnable city of Babylon and killed the then king Belshazzar. And you read the transition from one empire to the next empire in Daniel chapter 5, if you want to turn back to in your page, verses 30 to 31, with these short words. That very night, Belshazzar, that's the king Belshazzar, that very night, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain, and Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. Just like that, a change in world power. Where is Daniel in all of this? By this stage, he's probably in his 80s. Remember, he came as a captive to Babylon as a young teenager. He's now in his 80s. Daniel chapter 5, he's kind of like pulled out of retirement because they had a problem of how to read this writing on the wall. God empowers him, enables him to read the writing and declare a prophecy or a condemnation of King Belshazzar. And so it seems as if Daniel has survived this leadership change and he has maintained the king's favor. Why? Because God is at work. And you read this in chapter 6. And behind each of chapters 1 to 5, and now in chapter 6, there's this question: is God in control? Is God still in control? And so you get to this change between chapter 5 and chapter 6, and this change in king and kingdom and world empire. And you're asking, well, there's a change, there's a new king. Is God still in control? And what we'll see, just like the answer to Daniel chapter 1 to 5, which is, yes, God's still in control. In chapter 6, as we've read, what will be the answer? Yes, God is still in control. And so chapter 6 starts with reminding us that God is at work. In the first 5 verses of Daniel chapter 6, we see that Daniel is again faithful in his work. And secondly, we see what God has chosen to do through Daniel. Notice the emphasis, what God has chosen to do through Daniel. You see, as we are introduced to Daniel chapter 6 in the first few verses, we read that Darius has organized his empire, the Babylonian Empire that he's now conquered, into a way in which it's governed by 120 governors or satraps. And then over those, there are 3, one of whom is Daniel. And then listen to what we read about Daniel and the place of favor that he has found himself in verse 3, where we read these words. Now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. In other words, he had found such favor with the king that the king planned to make him effectively the prime minister over the whole of the Babylonian kingdom. Just imagine that. He is one of the exiles from Jerusalem, brought into Babylon as a captive, and now you have King Darius wanting him to point Daniel as the prime minister of the land above all of the native Babylonians, all of the wise people, all of the wealthy people, the ones that thought that they were the rulers of the land. Guess what? A bit of jealousy comes in at that point, isn't there? There's a bit of, I imagine, this sort of thinking, how dare the king do that? We're true Babylonians, and he won't even let us rule our own people. He's got this person from Jerusalem that came as a captive. He wants to put over the whole of the kingdom. You can just imagine that sort of thinking, can't you? And so jealousy creeps in, just like politics today, right? You can see it playing out again. But in any event, we know that jealousy crept in, and they start thinking, how are we going to get rid of this Daniel? How are we going to deal with this? And so they start looking at Daniel's conduct. And what do they see? They examine his way of governing and his governmental affairs. And we read, as we read together, they couldn't find any corruption, they couldn't find any incompetence, and they couldn't find anything where he was not trustworthy. They could not find any ground, true or spurious, in order to level an allegation against Daniel. That's a pretty good testimony, isn't it? Don't think these people weren't prepared to lie. Even being prepared to lie, they couldn't find anything against which to bring a charge against Daniel. Now there, for all of us, is a testimony to aspire to, right? You know, Daniel was faithful, and he was recognized for his faithfulness by the king. But recognition isn't the key. His faithfulness was. You see, whether or not we are recognized isn't the issue. The question is, are we faithful? I was reminded and was looked up and read through a little bit of the summary of William Carey. Many of you will have heard of William Carey, one of the missionary fathers to India for the period 1793 to 1834. He was responsible and partly responsible for translating parts of the Bible into 24 different languages. That's an amazing feat. Takes great intellect, great discipline, a lot of hard work and effort. But you wouldn't think that that would have been the result from his humble beginnings. You see, he started off as a cobbler. What's a cobbler? Someone who fixes shoes. Not a shoemaker, someone who fixes shoes. And he was looked down on and wasn't recognized for what he had done. And there's a story of him going to this dinner in India where there were some more distinguished guests, shall we say, and one of them wanted to put William Carey down and said something like, "I suppose, Mr. Carey, you once worked as a shoemaker." In his humility, Carey responded, "No, your lordship, not as a shoemaker, only a cobbler." Get the difference? The put down was, "Oh, you're a shoemaker." William Carey comes back with, "Actually, I was only a shoe repairer, a cobbler." You see, little could William Carey know how God would use his faithful work. Just imagine that. His faithful endeavors as a shoe repairer. How was God going to use him? In a mighty way. Even such a mighty way that here in Sydney in 2023, we're actually talking about him. There's a legacy of faithfulness, not based on recognition, but on faithfulness to the work that God had called him to do at that time for his glory. You see, just like Daniel, just like William Carey, we are called to be faithful in what God has asked us to do. How God uses us and how God uses our faithfulness to him is a matter for him. It could be like Daniel, or it could be like William Carey, faithfully working away as a shoemaker. That's not the point. The point is it starts with faithfulness to God and what he has called us to do. And so we see in these first 5 verses the first lesson from this passage, which is when we are faithful in our work, God is at work. You know, if we'd read together through the first 6 chapters of Daniel, one thing that keeps jumping out is that Daniel is someone who comes across as really calm, measured, and consistent in what he does. And so in this next lesson in verses 6 through 12, we see Daniel's calm response in the face of adversity. We see that notwithstanding the threat and challenge to his life, he remains and continues to be faithful in his worship of God. And because he is faithful in his worship, God is at work. You know, we touched on just before the jealousy that the other rulers no doubt had of Daniel and his favored position. And so what do? They hatch the plot. They play to the king's ego. And they say, "Oh, king, we think you should make a rule that no one should pray to anyone but you for 30 days. Keep in mind, at that time, kings thought of themselves as being God, like gods. So they thought of themselves as being divine in that sense. And so that would have played to his ego, right? Everyone would have said, "Oh, that's a great idea. Why not?" They may have even said, "Oh, look, for the unity of the kingdom, we just think it's really important for everyone to focus on you and focus on being a good Babylonian for the next 30 days. So why don't you make a rule that everyone just prays to you for 30 days? You can see how you could put it, right? Anyway, the king goes, "Great idea, let me make that rule." Notice the lie and the misrepresentation. When we read those words together, I emphasized the fact that when they came to the king, they said all had agreed. Had all agreed? No. Who had been missed out? Daniel. Exactly right. So what would Daniel do? You could imagine the range of reactions that he may have had, faced with the call and the risk of death to himself. Would he or would he not follow the rule of his king, the king that he had been faithfully serving? Well, Daniel did what he always did. He went and prayed. In fact, he prayed 3 times a day. In a different translation, and just the mind, it's not that one translation is right and the others are wrong. It's just the way the translators approach the language of translating, in this case, from Hebrew and Aramaic into English. Some are more literal, some have other approaches. In one of them, and I think we read it out from a translation this morning, it says, verse 10 reads like this, "And he continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day, praying and giving thanks before his God, as he had been doing previously." Notice the emphasis? Daniel kept on doing what he'd always been doing. He did not change. You know, Daniel could have been tempted to say, well, it's only 30 days. What I might do is just stop outwardly praying and visibly praying. I won't pray to King Darius, but I'll just stop the way I've been praying up till now, just for the 30 days. It's a short period of time. He could have, maybe he was tempted to say that. He could have said, this is a test of where my allegiance is. Let me make a big show of the fact that I follow God of Judah, the God of the Jews. And he could have made a big spectacle of himself. He did neither of those 2 things, did he? He didn't change what he did. He carried on as if nothing had changed. You see, I don't read this part as saying there's a certain way you have to react in the face of challenges, particularly challenges to your faith. It all depends on the context and our personalities. We are all different in that regard, right? But there are certain principles that must inform how we react and are the critical things to keep in mind. And what was the principle that Daniel was following? It was this. It was that he must not stop worshiping God or placing anyone or anything ahead of God. You see that? He didn't breach that principle. You know, if he had stopped praying, he would have. If he had prayed to King Darius, he would have. He did neither of those two things. And how he reacted based on complying with that principle was a matter for him. You know, the trap was set. They caught Daniel out. And I could just imagine these governors with glee going back to King Darius and saying, you know what? You made that rule. Now let us tell you, Daniel has breached that rule and he's off to the lion's den. You can just sense that when you're reading the story. How would the king react? Well, look at verse 14. We see how the king reacts to this news. When the king heard this, he was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sundown to save him. The king realized his mistake, but he could not save Daniel because his word had to stand. And so we move to verse 17 where we read that Daniel was thrown into the lion's den. And the question at that point is what would happen next? You know, all of us at some point are going to be called to navigate our commitment to following Jesus and worshiping God with challenges from the outside, whether they be direct or indirect from the community, from culture, however it occurs, these challenges will happen. And the question is, how will you react? And how will I react? You see, Daniel had very clear principles against which he made his decision. He didn't try and work those principles out at the time. He simply followed the principles against which he lived his life, and he'd been living his life for many, many years. He continued to pray. Why? Because it was consistent with the principle of life that he had set for himself about how he would honor and follow his God. Was this the first time he had exercised that principle? No. In your own reading, have a look at chapter 1. Daniel, as a young teenager, is brought in captivity and chosen to be put into the king's university. And what does this young teenager do? He challenges the requirement of great King Nebuchadnezzar to eat his food, and he refuses to do so. Why? Because it would dishonor his God. Young teenager following principle, someone in his 80s, now mature, following the same principle. Daniel was consistent in his faith and his commitment to honoring and following his God across the whole span of life in different circumstances, meeting different challenges. And as we've seen, Daniel prayed just as he had done. And so we ask ourselves, would that be me? Would that be you? The second lesson we learn from this passage is that when we are faithful in our worship, God is at work. When we consider Daniel being marched to the lion's den and then dropped into the den, it's hard to see that God's at work, right? At that point in time, you think, woo, well, his loyalty is commendable, but probably misplaced. Look where it's ended up for Daniel. Bottom of the lion's pit. Not a great place to be. But this story is written in a way that leaves you wondering, has God been defeated? Has Daniel wasted his time? And in the third lesson we read from this passage, it's that when we are faithful, God is at work. You know, before we go any further, let's remind ourselves that even if these lions had ripped Daniel to pieces, God was still at work because God is sovereign and in control of all things. We know that because in Daniel chapter 3, when Daniel's three friends were threatened with their life of bow down and worship this golden image, or I will throw you into the fiery furnace. Listen to what Daniel's three friends say in response to the threat to their lives in Daniel chapter 3, verses 17 to 18. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he is able to deliver us from your majesty's hand. You see that? Able. Emphasis on the word able. Then this, but even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. You see the point? Life or death was a matter for God, but either way, he was in control. What he demanded was faithfulness. And so what would happen next? Daniel is in the lion's den. There is a real sense that God would act. And we get the sense from King Darius himself, who had been searching for a way to remove the charge from Daniel and prevent him from being thrown into the lion's den. I wonder whether in his searches, keep in mind he's the king, he can command all sorts of things. I wonder in telling people to find a solution to the problem, someone at some point had delved into the history of the Babylonians and said, don't forget Daniel's three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. I just wonder. We don't know that, but I wonder. I wonder because listen to these words in verse 16 that King Darius leaves with Daniel. He says, may your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you. And the reason why I say that is, why would a king say something like that unless he thought there was a possibility that it could occur? Well, we know it's more than a possibility, because when we read in verses 21 to 23, we see that God is at work, and indeed, just as the king hoped, so God acted. Was God at work? He sure was. Just as the King Darius, who was a powerful figure of that time, what he could not do in saving Daniel, God did. Notice the difference in the contrast. King Darius, asserting himself to be the most powerful man in the world, couldn't save Daniel. God saved Daniel. See the contrast? Who's in control? God's in control. Daniel responds and says, in response to the king's eager request as to his state, he says, listen to this, my God sent his angel and shut the mouths of the lions. You see, God had protected Daniel and had delivered him from the lions. King Darius couldn't. God did. And Daniel goes on the reason why. He says, I was not hurt, verse 22. Why? Because I was found innocent in God's sight. That is Daniel's way, in a very courageous way of saying, I have been vindicated by the God Most High in refusing and failing to follow your decree, King Darius. And what's the final word on this whole event? Have a look there at verse 23. When we look at these, we see that trusting in God is the beginning of God's work. And in verse 23, we read these key words. Daniel is pulled out of the lion's den. He's inspected and there's no scratch found on him or no wound found on him. And then listen to these final words of verse 23. Because he had trusted in his God. Get the point of the passage? You know, You might be tempted to think, oh, those lions that had their full meals, they were lazy, tired, there was no danger to Daniel. It was all just one of these, this is all a beat up. But no, deliberately, verse 24 tells us that these were dangerous lions. His accusers are dropped into the lion's den and they are ripped to pieces. God had indeed shut the mouths of the lions for Daniel. And so, as his accusers had done to Daniel, so done to them. Even when the stone is rolled over the den and there are roaring lions around, this story reminds us that all hope is not lost. Whatever happens next, God is at work. You know, in this case, God chose to save Daniel for his purposes, one of which is that today, here this morning, we are reading this account and recognizing that it was God who rescues and it's God who's in control. God is at work because Daniel trusted him. When we are faithful, God is at work. And so for us who are followers of Jesus, there's a clear call to remain faithful in our work that God has called us to do this week, to be faithful in our worship, because in ways we may never understand, God is at work in and through our faithfulness. So God has saved Daniel, and the king recognizes this. God is in control. How would the king react? Well, let's read a few verses together. Verse 26. He says, I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom, people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. What a change. That's the ruling he should have made first up, right? But he's now come full circle, and he's now making a decree that recognizes that everyone must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. We move on and listen to some of what his testimony is, of what he has now learnt of who the God of Daniel is. For he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. Verse 27, he rescues and saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. What a mighty testimony from the king of that time, right? He testifies to the nature and character of God. His nature, he is alive. This means that he can act in history and respond to the needs of his people. He is a king. His kingdom is forever. And he's a God who delivers. He's a God who in character and nature rescues. That was the king of Babylon's objective assessment of who God is. We are told more in applying that to Daniel's own deliverance. Daniel was in the lion's pit. God responded to his need. Those lions threatened Daniel's life. The king could not save Daniel, but God in his power miraculously intervened and shut the mouths of the lions. Daniel needed rescuing. God rescued Daniel because God is a rescuing God. We've celebrated that this morning, haven't we? In what we've heard and in the act of eating the bread and the juice, we are celebrating that our God is a rescuing God. This passage calls us to look forward in history to the life and death of Jesus, the Son of God. He is alive. Through Jesus, God faithfully reached into history and provided and met the need that people had at that time, that we have today. which is a need to be saved from our sins, which we have heard about this morning. Because he is alive, he can reach into history and meet our needs. He is the King forever. Jesus died and in his death took the punishment of the sins of our sins, and as we read this morning, the sins of the whole world. And he rose again. He lives forever. He rescues us. We have new life in Jesus. He is a rescuing God, and we celebrate that. You see the proclamation in Daniel chapter 6 of who our God is, pointing forward to who the work of Jesus that we celebrate this morning. What a marvelous message. When we are faithful, God's name is praised. So the call for us this morning is, will we be faithful in this coming week, and in so doing, bring praise to our God? If you are here this morning thinking, I'd like to know some more about this rescuing that we're talking about and what we've celebrated and spoken about this morning, understand that when you say, I will follow you, God, and Jesus, thank you for dying for me on the cross, there is no greater act of praise and worship that you can give. When we are faithful, God's name is praised. What have we seen this morning from Daniel chapter 6? We've seen that God is in control. That underlying question under the passage, is God in control, is answered absolutely. God is in control. And the amazing thing is that when we are faithful, we can be part of demonstrating and living out the fact that God is in control. You get that? It's an amazing privilege, isn't it? When we are faithful, God can bring us in to being part of what he is doing and demonstrating his control. We may not know how, we may not know why, we may struggle through all of those circumstances, but if we remain faithful and trust in God just like Daniel, we can be assured that God is indeed at work. I started by asking the question, is God in control when someone is at the point of a gun being told to give up your faith or die? In 2007, there was a doctor called Dr. Reginald Zaharuddin in Pakistan. He was a surgeon serving in a medical hospital, a Christian, faithfully serving the wounded in the battle and the fighting, and he's kidnapped for 25 days. He, at one point, is threatened with beheading unless he gave up his faith in Jesus, which he refused to do. Is God faithful? Yes. In Dr. Reginald's case, God chose to deliver him from his hostage situation. And indeed from there called him into a ministry in Pakistan called Mercy Home. I'm not sure if you've heard of that, but again, a marvelous story where he now, in addition to his medical work, seeks to save and seeks to bring out of modern day slavery many families working in the brick making, I won't call it an industry, but the brick making fields there in Pakistan. When faced with the threat of your life, holding firm to your profession of faith in Jesus, is God at work? Yes, he is. Dr. Reginald professes to that. Even if it had not turned out the way it did, God is still at work. And so this morning, let us be encouraged that when we are faithful in our service, faithful in our worship, what? God is at work. And most importantly, God's name is praised. So may we be encouraged with the lesson from Daniel chapter 6 this morning. Thank you.